We are today with Javed Butler. You know Javed, who has been involved in so many trials in heart failure and other cardiorenal and diabetes drug development. Javed is also sitting on the board of the FDA, and he's been co-PI of Victoria, Victoria, the Vericiguat HFrEF trial. And it is as such that I would like to ask him about the recent approval by the FDA of the Vericiguat in HFrEF. So, Javed, um, you have been, like me, familiar with the approval track from the FDA, which usually in HFrEF mandate that they have at least one strong positive trial with a p-value of 0.005 or maybe with 0.025 or maybe two with zero point zero 0.005 each of them. So I'd like you, before we getting there, just to summarize the label behind the recent approval of Vericiguat in HFrEF.
Yeah, well, Fayez, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to go over the Vericiguat label. Just to clarify, I was not the co-PI for the Victoria trial, but I was on the steering committee. Having said that, I was also involved in the Socrates trial that preceded the Victoria trial as well. So I've been in the development program for a long time. So the indication that was awarded by the FDA was for reduction of cardiovascular death or heart failure hospitalization in patients with worsening heart failure requiring either hospitalization or outpatient IV diuretic in those with chronic HFrEF and ejection fraction less than 45%. So pretty much the broad inclusion criteria of the trial, and the primary endpoint was what the indication that was given. So the question that you're really asking is that this trial had 10% relative risk reduction in the composite endpoint, and the p-value was positive, but did not reach the threshold of 0.00125. Neither did it reach the threshold of 2 trial, and it was approved. And there is, we can have a technical discussion, or we can have a more sort of a clinically oriented discussion. And the clinically oriented discussion is that do you sort of look at disease states or risk states that either there are no therapies available, so you have a little bit of a different threshold. So heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, there are no therapies. So if something is positive, how long do you wait? And then when it comes to Victoria, it was really not a run-of-the-mill heart failure with reduced ejection fraction patient trial. These were patients with worsening heart failure. And this is not only a matter of label. This is a real issue because if you look at the placebo event rate in this trial, it was not 5, 10, 15, 20% higher. It was 2 to 3 times higher than Paradigm or DAPA-HF. The placebo event rate was almost hitting 40% at 1 year. So I think in this very high-risk subgroup of patients, whether or not you should look at it a little bit differently. So I'm happy to go into sort of the issues with trial design and conduct that also makes the FDA decision, at least to me, very acceptable, that we don't necessarily need to follow the same rules in this particular patient population.
Yeah, so you are making a good point that because the peculiarity of the population is very high risk, they have applied maybe slightly different rules, but how have they taken into consideration the other evidence beyond and above the primary endpoint, and whether the FDA is prepared to talk and discuss and take into account the totality of evidence? I am referring here, for example, the quality of life results and and also the mechanistic plausibility. I'd like you to comment on these 2 issues.
Yeah, so obviously my involvement in the trial led me to be completely not be involved in any of the FDA discussions related to this trial. So I have no clue what were the deliberations as far as the FDA was concerned. And as you know, that this did not go through an advisory committee anyway. So I don't know the FDA thinking. But I can give you at least my perspective. That first of all, we all can have an academic discussion about this issue of absolute risk reduction and relative risk reduction. And what I find pretty fascinating about this is that, of course, your absolute risk reduction is based on the baseline risk. I totally get it. And in that sense, the relative risk reduction is pretty easy. But we always question it in one direction. So we will say that if you have an absolute risk reduction in this high risk group, how do you know that in low risk group this drug works? But we never ask the question the other way around, that when drugs are tested in low risk population, how do we know whether they're going to work in the high risk population, right? Regardless of that debate, the absolute risk reduction in this trial in this high risk population was like 4.2% absolute risk reduction. The number needed to treat was, I think, 24 or something like that. So it was very comparable, or at least numerically better than other trials. So if you start putting that sort of this whole totality of evidence mindset, you start sort of looking into that. So then the issue comes up is the components of the primary endpoint, right? So cardiovascular death and heart failure hospitalization. So cardiovascular death, there was an 8% reduction in cardiovascular death, which was not statistically significant. But remember, one problem is that we used to do trials which were all powered for mortality. Now we have these composite endpoints, and these high-risk patients, they are at such high risk for hospitalization that you reach your primary endpoint pretty fast. So the average follow-up in Victoria was like 10.8 months. This is a very short. So for cardiovascular mortality, the modifiable cardiovascular mortality, remember in these high-risk patients, some people will be destined to die, but the modifiable high-risk mortality really takes some time. And the heart failure hospitalization, the p-value, the upper bound of the confidence interval was exactly 1.00. So again, if we are not in that mindset of the p-value, I think all of these things are heading in the direction that this really works. If you also then add the biologic plausibility.
Yeah, well, you are referring to biological plausibility. How much did that weigh into favor of approval, and in general, whether this is taken into consideration in interpreting trial results?
I mean, I would say that, a Victoria trial took some risks, right? So one risk they took was to go into the high risk worsening population. And we are learning now that in the clinical trials, the high risk patients have more events, but the more risk modification may tend to be in the lower risk population. So that was one risk Victoria took. Which I think in retrospect, maybe the trial should have been done very much like Paradigm HF or DAPA-HF in your more standard and not high-risk patient population. The other risk they took is that they went to EF up to 45%. And in retrospect, maybe that was not a good idea, because we know that Vitality trial did not show any benefit in HFpEF. And in Victoria trial, if you look at 40 to 45%, and there was a sizable minority between 40 to 45%, really did not benefit, and it was the lower ejection fraction that was benefiting. So again, if you look at the target, the biologic plausibility, and if you start carving out from Victoria a usual HFrEF population, Carolyn Lamb had a paper recently published in JAMA Cardiology showing that those patients that were enrolled in the hospital versus those that had hospitalization more than 3 months ago, they tended to benefit more. So the more you start getting into sort of the run-of-the-mill HFrEF population, the benefit is not only there, but it actually is even more exaggerated. Well, including cardiovascular mortality benefit also reaches p-value.
That's a good point. And it's really nice to see that for once at least, a trial which has been started on the basis of targeting a specific mechanisms led to positive results, because most of our heart failure trials got from chance or serendipity, right? But so I agree with that. I like the process so far. You have raised a number of observations regarding subgroups, the more severe, less severe, and ejection fraction segments, etc. One subgroup of attention in the trial is patients with the highest NT-proBNP, and the label does not refer to that. So how practically patient will be managed, and how doctors will manage whether they will be measuring the NT-proBNP or getting away from this very highest group of patients, or don't pay attention to just a subgroup finding and not much consequences.
Yeah, so I'm personally sort of glad that in the label there's not a specific requirement for NT-proBNP, because that really decreases, sort of raises the bar in terms of what the clinicians have to do in order to be able to use the therapy. I think, so there was a pre-specified analysis in the trial with NT-proBNP quartiles. The top quartile did not have the benefit, but then the bottom three quartile had cardiovascular mortality also reached statistically significant, and the relative risk reduction, forget about the absolute risk reduction, even the relative risk reduction then starts getting to the 20+% range, like we look at with other therapies like Paradigm or GAP-HF or Emperor Reduce. So that led to a very detailed analysis of NT-proBNP, and it turns out that all the way of up to NT-proBNP of greater than 8,000, less than 8,000, there was mortality and hospitalization benefit, but the extreme over 8,000, there was no benefit. So how do you interpret that result? Remember that all the trials, whether it is ACE inhibitors or beta blockers or MRA or ARNI, there will be some group of patients that will not be responsive to the therapy. We don't reduce mortality and hospitalization by 100%. There are some people who are responsive, some people are not. And in this case, we actually evaluated who are the people who respond and who don't. My personal interpretation is this. First, the people in the 1990s who were really sick, who were on digoxin and diuretic, you could do anything, ACE inhibitor, beta blocker, you can improve their outcomes. But in 2020, on ACE inhibitor and beta blocker and MRA, remember in Victoria, 90+% of the patients were on RAS inhibitor, beta blocker, and 70+% were on MRA. On this background therapy, if your NT-proBNP is still greater than 8,000, you belong to one of the two groups. Either you're really congested, and with 2 doses of diuretics tomorrow, you'll be 5,000, or no matter what you do, you'll be greater than 8,000 and you need a transplant or better. And I think clinicians can make that differentiation, and I don't think we should be requiring them to measure NT-proBNP to be able to use this therapy.
That's very clear. Now, you and me share the privilege of being on Emperor Reduced and on the SGLT2 inhibitor saga. Recommendation to the prescriber are simple when it comes to SGLT2 inhibitors because we have abundance of data, and these are pretty much to all comers in the heart failure space. Now, where Vericiguat would fit in the sequencing of evidence-based heart failure therapy now that we have few or more kids on the block?
Yeah, so I'll give you sort of two answers to this and then my sort of opinion. So first of all, to my knowledge, whenever we have tested a drug in heart failure that shows positive results, that has non-overlapping pathway, baseline therapy doesn't matter. So, ACE inhibitor will help whether or not beta blockers are given. Beta blockers will work whether or not MRA is given. ARNI will work whether or not MRA is given. So these are parallel independent pathways. The only exception that I know of is the interaction between ivabradine and beta blocker, but then it's not independent pathway, right? There's a big overlap of heart rate reduction. So these are not independent pathways. So in that sense, one can say that the pathway that Vericiguat is affecting, maybe it should be used irrespective of the baseline therapy, except that that's not the trial we did. That's not the trial. The trial was in worsening heart failure people on stable medical therapy who are breaking through. So I think the label says that, and I don't know what the guidelines are going to say, but I think we should stick to where the evidence is. That if you're on chronic outpatient therapy and now you're breaking through from that therapy and requiring IV diuretic in the outpatient setting or hospitalization, then this is a very good option to reduce the risk. Two quick comments. One, once you start getting this into this worsening, and although we are talking about the Victoria trial, it's really not about Victoria trial. It's about whatever, IV iron, revascularization, atrial fibrillation treatment, whatever it is. Remember, this worsening heart failure can go in two directions. You either optimally treat them and pull them back into residual risk, or you ignore them and they become advanced heart failure needing transplant VADs and all that kind of stuff. So this is a vulnerable period that we need to treat them pretty aggressively. Having said that, If you look at the NT-proBNP result, the distance from the heart failure hospitalization at the time of randomization, all of these things are loudly saying that there is no reason to believe that this drug should be limited to worsening heart failure. Now, whether or not the sponsors will do a trial in sort of the standard heart failure, I have no idea. But I think that's the way it should go.
Great. Javed, thank you so much. Have been really very clear answers, and I hope that will contribute to the implementation of the result of Victoria now that we have yet another drug. And I know that it's going to be a busy area, and we all expect the future guidelines. Just a very brief comment on your guess on what direction will the future guidelines take in the HFrEF place?
I mean, I think the American College of Cardiology recently published an expert consensus pathway document. So if the guidelines go in that direction, then I would say that the quad therapy with ARNI, evidence-based beta blockers, MRA, and evidence-based SGLT2 inhibitor is really the new foundational therapy. And irrespective of any other consideration, all HFrEF patients should be given these 4 therapies. So if I were to bet, I think that's the direction things are heading.
Well, I don't expect there would be any Atlantic divide. I am pretty sure that in ESC, the situation is going to be exactly the same. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I hope that everybody will enjoy this very nice chat.
Thank you.